Hi and welcome everybody to this episode of Determinate Content. Today we're very pleased to be joined by Sami Pihlström, who is Professor of Philosophy of Religion at the Faculty of Theology at the University of Helsinki. And he's the author of over 15 books and more than 100 articles. And he works on the philosophy of religion, pragmatism, ethics, and metaphysics. Do you think that's a good description?
Well, yes. Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to this series. I'm very pleased to be here. And yes, I guess that's a fair description. Yes. I mean, I haven't worked on philosophy of religion all the way from the beginning, but I am sort of gradually, I have moved into that direction over the years and decades quite a bit.
Yeah. And today we're going to be talking about your book, Pragmatist Metaphysics, and also that very notion. So, but you said before we started that many of your books have roughly the same theme. Would you say that this is like the glue that holds them all, your work all together?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, I do have I suppose a relatively large number of publications, but I have the feeling that I'm getting back to the same issues all over again, and in some sense writing the same book all over again, revisiting issues that I have discussed in earlier work, and perhaps always from a slightly different perspective, adding some new ideas and issues here and there, but yeah, I mean, I've been interested since I actually started to work and publish in philosophy. I've been interested in the realism issue, in the ways in which the pragmatist tradition deals with the realism issue in the context of various philosophical problems and areas like metaphysics in general, but also ethics, philosophy of religion, philosophy of science. So I mean, the book that you proposed, we will now discuss, called Pragmatist Metaphysics. That's already a little bit old one, 2009.
Yeah.
But I think I'm sort of examining some of the same issues in some more recent work as well. So I'm very pleased to talk about it.
Yeah, it's really good to have you on. So the question I always ask to everyone who's been on this series is, how did you get in philosophy, and why do you think it's a worthwhile thing to do?
Well, how did I get into philosophy? I suppose I don't have any dramatic story to tell about that. I in fact initially started to study engineering and economics in the late 80s, but then very soon realized that this is not really the thing that I'm deeply interested in, and I started taking philosophy classes and ended up studying philosophy at the turn of the decade, late 80s, early 90s, and then enrolled as a doctoral student in philosophy. So maybe I should mention that even though I currently work and have worked for several years at the Faculty of Theology at the University of Helsinki, I never really studied theology. I don't have any theological background training. I mean, my training is purely in philosophy. And I mean, in Helsinki, as well as in some other Scandinavian universities, philosophy of religion is within the theology faculty. It's more or less the same in Uppsala, for example. But I'm very pleased to work together with my theology colleagues there, who often have an immense historical learning of the kind that I don't have.
Yeah, and secondly, why do you think philosophy is a worthwhile?
Yeah.
So perhaps the harder.
That's a fundamental question. Well, again, I don't know if I have any original or interesting answer to that, but philosophy deals with the most general questions we can think of, and also the kind of generality. You don't have to be a specialist in any particular field. You can try to take a general overview, and I think we do need something like that in our culture. Also, what is fundamentally important in philosophy generally, no matter what kind of philosophy you do, is some sort of critical approach, so that you take the kind of critical distance to whatever it is that you're dealing with. Always trying to think whether the received view in whatever area is correct, or should somehow be revised or questioned. So this generality and then this critical perspective on basically whatever you're interested in. I think those are very important features of philosophical work in general. I don't think the importance or significance of philosophy for our culture is exhausted by these characteristics of philosophy, but I do think they are quite important.
So what other features would you say has an important importance in culture?
Awareness of the kind of difficulty of even some fairly basic concepts that somehow structure our lives. That basically almost everything can be questioned and criticized, and things are not as simple as they might look. And the basic critical potential, the possibility of somehow digging deeper into the fundamental assumptions defining our ordinary lives, scientific research, and the pursuit of scientific truth, as well as, of course, ethical and political discussions.
Right. Yeah. So, tying on to that, perhaps that last part about our ethical assumptions and trying to perhaps find a worldview, which is a very difficult endeavor. Your book, Pragmatist Metaphysics, try to weave these together in some ways. So say that the way we construct our worldviews, our metaphysics, should depend or be grounded in ethics somehow. So I guess I have a sort of a two-tiered question. Firstly, what is your interpretation of pragmatism? What does that mean for you? And secondly, what is the resulting pragmatist metaphysics? What is that supposed to look like?
Yeah, well, the pragmatist tradition, if we think about the historical tradition of pragmatism, and the tradition that was inaugurated by philosophers such as Charles Peirce, William James, John Dewey to some extent, and others, and then further developed during the 20th century up to more recent neo-pragmatism. It's of course a rich tradition, a heterogeneous tradition which hardly has any defining essence. There are pragmatists that are quite different from each other, and also that is part of what I find interesting in pragmatism. Although it might sound simple that pragmatism somehow emphasizes practice or human action. This can be done in very different ways, and it would be really difficult or impossible to somehow capture the essence of pragmatist philosophy in any sort of easily definable thesis or anything like that. But that said, I would emphasize when we approach this pragmatist tradition, or if I'm trying to think about what would be my sort of interpretation of pragmatism in general, I would emphasize the deep entanglement of theory and practice in some sense. I wouldn't say that according to pragmatism, theory is simply based on practice, or that practice is prior to theory. I think that's a kind of a reductive and a kind of narrow understanding of pragmatism. Of course, there are differences among individual pragmatist thinkers, but on the whole, my sort of favorite version of pragmatism would emphasize the entanglement of these rather than the priority of practice in relation to theory. So that would then mean, I mean, this entanglement idea would then mean that whatever our theoretical pursuits are, whatever theoretical questions we ask about the world, about the ways things are, they always have some connection, at least some highly indirect connection to our human concerns, our human purposive practice, our needs and interests, something that we are doing in the world. Or our habits of action, as the pragmatist classics would put it. So I think we should take seriously the pragmatist classics like Percy's and James's ways of speaking about our beliefs about the world as habits of action of some kind. I mean, it seems to me that they mean this rather literally, that that's what beliefs are. Beliefs are not just some representations in the mind that would then somehow ground some habits of acting, but they are habits of action. To believe the world to be in a way or another is already to be engaged in some habit of action, not necessarily to actually act in a certain way, but to somehow be committed to some habituality, and I think that is important. To believe anything is always already to be in the world, to use a slightly Heideggerian expression. I don't want to go into that, of course, but yeah. So I don't know if this makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. So would you say that in pragmatist metaphysics, if you combine that entanglement of practice and theory, that would be a sort of metaphysics that doesn't neglect the role our practices play in?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, of course, traditionally, if we think about metaphysics, it's one of the most purely theoretical activities, right? It's theoria in the classical sense, of course, and obviously many of the metaphysical questions that people who write about metaphysics and teach metaphysics and do research in metaphysics, some of those questions are extremely theoretical, like questions concerning like the existence of universals, for example, nominalism versus realism, or maybe modalities, the persistence of identity over time, various issues of that kind that could be taken to be highly theoretical. And of course, they are rather far removed from our everyday concerns and even from our scientific concerns. But according to pragmatism, they would still necessarily, I suppose we can say, they would still have some connection to our human interests and our need to somehow conceptualize and categorize the reality we live in. So I don't want to say that these abstract metaphysical questions would somehow have to be immediately practically relevant, or that they would have some immediate societal impact, for example, in the kind of research that focuses on those questions. I mean, I'm definitely in favor of highly theoretical research in philosophy and more generally, of course. And I don't think pragmatism generally, or pragmatist metaphysics in particular, needs to be committed to any, narrowly instrumentalist or instrumentalizing attitude of the instrumental value of theoretical research. Theoretical research is valuable in itself, even if it focuses on these kind of extremely abstract metaphysical questions. But those questions themselves are somehow indistinguishable, ultimately indistinguishable and entangled with human problems and human concerns.
Right.
What it is to be a human being in the world, trying to reflect on what the world is like. That's more or less what I would like in a very brief response. What I would like to say.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess, I mean, pragmatist metaphysics will, to some people, sound as a bit of an oxymoron almost, because for some metaphysical realists, it will sound like it's trying to bring in some kind of practical questions that aren't relevant to the ultimate nature of reality. And to pragmatists, it might sound that you're trying to rectify or save an enterprise metaphysics, which is doomed to failure anyway. So if you think about like if one thinks about the neo-pragmatists who dislike metaphysics, but you argue that you want to steer like a middle course between these two camps. And do you think that's so? Yeah, how is that done?
Yeah, that's not one of the easiest questions, I'm afraid, and that's why I've written about this.
Yeah.
A bit, because it's not easy to say how it is supposed to be done. But you're quite right. When talking about pragmatist metaphysics, you can get criticism from both sides, so to speak, from traditional, for example, what we might call mainstream analytic metaphysics, like neo-Aristotelian kind of metaphysics, which aims at categorizing reality more or less as it is in itself, independently of our practical concerns or independently of our human perspectives and so on. So philosophers who work in that field or that kind of research program, like basically analytic philosophers who would be specializing in metaphysics today, many of them would say that this kind of pragmatism stuff, exactly as you said, that's not really metaphysics. It's something else, and it doesn't seek to represent the independent world in the sense in which like proper work in metaphysics attempts to do. So people like, let's say, David Armstrong was a paradigm example of a metaphysician in that kind of tradition. He would have had little patience with pragmatism, I guess. He didn't have much to say about pragmatism. And then on the other side, so to speak, we would have philosophers like Richard Rorty, who would somehow argue that pragmatism is all the way from the beginning, it's somehow anti-metaphysical, and it's only because we make these these problematic representationalist background assumptions that we have these metaphysical as well as epistemological problems in the first place, and then when we drop those assumptions, we just get rid of these unnecessary and somehow illusionary problems. We don't have to deal with those metaphysical problems at all when we realize that they are somehow pseudo problems. And of course, we could go back to the quite interesting relationship between pragmatism and logical empiricism, which, as we know, was a strongly anti-metaphysical movement, and certainly there is a strong strong element of criticism of metaphysics within the pragmatist tradition. That's clear. So definitely many of the pragmatists, early and late, have been important critics of metaphysics, and there is no denying that, of course. But at the same time, of course, we know that, for example, Charles Peirce developed his own distinctive, highly original system of metaphysics. Even William James, even though he, for example, if we look at the work Pragmatism, 1907, where he develops his version of this so-called pragmatic method and applies it to various problems, trying to argue that that they may in the end be pseudo problems that are not, that really don't have any pragmatically analyzable real content. Even James, I would say, is not trying to just eliminate metaphysics and metaphysical problems across the board. What he's trying to do when applying this so-called pragmatic method or the pragmatic maxim, what he's trying to do is to somehow trace out the pragmatic core of those problems, to tell us what it really means, what those problems really mean in terms of human habits of action and human life in the world. So I would say even James is at least tolerant to metaphysics, not willing to get rid of metaphysics as such, or on the whole, or completely, but willing to somehow understand pragmatically what metaphysics is and what it ought to be. But I do realize that that talking about pragmatist metaphysics may indeed sound like an oxymoron, and it is a controversial expression, and so, yeah.
I suppose that makes for an interesting name, though. It certainly kind of gets you excited.
Yeah, I mean, at least it's slightly controversial, and there is some also some historical research within pragmatism scholarship related to this. I mean, people specializing in James or Dewey, for example, might have different ideas about how exactly some of these classics. How did Dewey, for example, really conceive of metaphysics? Did Dewey believe there is something called metaphysics that we ought to pursue in some pragmatic sense, or was he more strongly or more radically critical of the whole thing? And then when we get to more recent neo-pragmatism, it's of course not only Rorty or the kind of radical Rortyian neo-pragmatism that is highly critical of metaphysics, but also then there are more moderate positions like Hilary Putnam's, for example, that would not be so clearly anti-metaphysical, I suppose, although Putnam too would be, or would have been, hesitant to make any metaphysical commitments himself. I'm not sure.
Yeah. I'm not sure how successful he was in that endeavor, but yeah, I'm also thinking of Quine, who is seen as one of the figures giving rise to metaphysics after positivism, who definitely was a pragmatist, and it's kind of interesting how some have taken his remarks to rescue metaphysics. On the other hand, some have taken him to be very critical towards metaphysics. But I don't think, you don't discuss Quine that much in the book. So, but do you have any views on?
Yeah, I've written on Quine previously, already in the 90s and early 2000s. But in that particular book, there is not that much on Quine. I agree. Quine's relation to the pragmatist tradition is an interesting issue on its own right, of course, and certainly Quine is one of those who in a way reopened the kind of pursuit of at least ontology or metaphysics after the flourishing of the logical positivism, maybe along with others quite different analytic philosophers like Peter Strawson, for example, who famously developed what he called descriptive metaphysics. About Quine, I guess we can say that he was a pragmatist of some kind, although he did not define his views in terms of the classical pragmatist tradition. He never went back to the classics like Peirce and James. I mean, he was interested in Peirce's logic. He was interested in Dewey's naturalism. I think, in epistemology naturalized and ontological relativity. At least he says something about Dewey, but of course he was not a historical scholar of pragmatism at all, and he developed his own pragmatic views, or whatever you call them, quite independently of the pragmatist tradition. And when he says, I think it's in Two Dogmas, that he espouses a more thorough pragmatism, that is in comparison presumably primarily to Carnap, and Carnap's kind of, well, in some sense, pragmatist view in whatever it's called, empiricism, semantics, ontology. So the internal and external questions, distinction, and all that. So when we emphasize Quine's role in the pragmatist tradition, we have to be careful to get this correct. Of course, that it's perhaps primarily in relation to logical empiricism and Carnap that he sort of develops his own project in this sort of pragmatist direction. When it comes to the question of whether Quine is doing metaphysics, I suppose there are many really dedicated Quine scholars who would have better informed views on that than I do. But but I suppose there is also some controversy there, because obviously Quine would have been very critical of any sort of philosophical metaphysics that would be somehow independent of science and or somehow prior to the scientific pursuit of truth. So when it comes to finding out what the world is like, limiting the true and ultimate structure of reality, or however that one of those famous phrases from Quine goes, then it's of course up to science to do that. But on the other hand, science is in some sense a pragmatic enterprise and constantly renewed and critically tested in the holistic sense, as described in Two Dogmas and elsewhere. So yeah, I mean, many of the questions that we can ask about this general project of pragmatist metaphysics, I suppose, can also be like specifically asked in relation to, or it can be asked about Quine's specific project, because that is, I would agree, I guess, that it is a kind of a project of pragmatist metaphysics in its own right, very different from mine, of course, because I take my sort of main points of departure from maybe William James and also Kant to some extent, and I don't think we can really place Quine in that tradition. But there are analogies, and they are important, and there is no denying of the fact that Quine was absolutely crucial in developing late analytic philosophy into the kind of direction where some of the most important analytic philosophers like Putnam then took a kind of a pragmatist turn. So definitely Quine played an enormously influential role there, even if he never himself went all the way to anything that we could properly pragmatism.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so maybe we should get into your views on how to conduct metaphysics then, because you said it was kind of towards a Jamesian view of the matter rather than a sort of a Quinean view. But I mean, when I first heard this phrase, pragmatist metaphysics, what I thought it was kind of like a kind of view in which if something is useful for us to believe, given the sort of beings we are, we ought to believe that, or even it is true that this thing obtains. And that I mean, I have quite a limited historical understanding of James, I must admit, but I sort of associate that with his views on God, that it's useful for us to believe that there's a God and therefore God exists, or we ought to believe that God exists. But I don't think this is what you're going for, right? Or would you say there's still, in your view, pragmatist metaphysics, does it leave open those that those sort of arguments are good arguments, or how do you view that?
Yeah, well, yeah, that's perhaps something that comes close to what William James called the will to believe, where the argument would be approximately what you just described, that somehow it would be useful or valuable for us to believe in the existence of God, for example, and then therefore that belief would be justified or acceptable or even true in the pragmatist sense, although the will to believe essay is not directly about truth that much. That is a kind of a rather straightforward way of formulating pragmatism, and when talking about James and the will to believe, we have to remember that the context in which we can, according to James himself, where we can legitimately apply that method, the will to believe method, so to speak, is a very carefully characterized context. With, first of all, the issue we're dealing with has to be undecidable on intellectual grounds. So we can't find any crucial evidence either way. For example, if we're considering some question, the typical example would be whether there is God or not. But in addition to that, the issue or this choice between different hypotheses or this option, as James calls it, has to be a genuine option in the sense that it's, as he says, live, forced, and momentous. So it's not just some trivial matter. It's something very deep and important for us, and something where we really cannot avoid choosing in a way or another. So it also resembles the kind of existential choices of life that could fundamentally direct one's life, in the sense in which existentialist thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre, for example, discussed such cases. So these will to believe kind of cases are not simply cases where we can legitimately believe something if we just feel like believing it, or if it's a useful or satisfactory belief. This usefulness or satisfactoriness has to be taken in an extremely broad sense, and like it is something that has to do with the persons or these subjects of belief, life as a whole, or something like that, and then perhaps that's the way we, in a way, come back to this idea of pragmatist conception of belief in general being ineliminably tied to action, and belief being literally a bit of action of some kind. So this would be the first thing to say about the will to believe. Again, I don't really deal with the will to believe in this particular book that much. There are some other publications where I try to contribute to the discussion concerning that, both the historical interpretation of James and the kind of more contemporary discussion of how that method ought to be, or could be, or might perhaps legitimately be developed and applied. Okay, so that's one thing. But then I maybe should emphasize, maybe you're getting to this issue later, but I should emphasize that in the way I try to deal with pragmatist metaphysics, both in this book and elsewhere, is kind of indebted to Kant, and I have this habit of reading the classical pragmatists and also pragmatism more generally as a kind of Kantian inspired, at least Kantian inspired, if not more strongly Kantian orientation. Of course, it's not Kantian strictly speaking, or of course, few pragmatists, if any, would be committed to basically the Kantian system of categories, for example, or some sort of Kantian ideas as such. But there would be a Kantian background there that cannot be neglected, I would say.
Yeah. So the one thing you discuss is this the sort of practical indispensability of God for Kant, that like God is a necessary posit in practice, and you many of the arguments in your book are sort of transcendental arguments of that sort. So it's like it's saying this in order to make sense of our practice of doing this, we have to posit the existence of this thing. So it might be like other persons, or might be modality or something like that. So would you say that's the method of pragmatist metaphysics in your view, rather than these kind of like more crude arguments of the sort that it's useful for me to believe X and therefore X is true, or I'm justified in believing X, at least if that's very narrowly understood?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say these pragmatist arguments are in metaphysics are at least closer to this kind of indispensability arguments that could also be formulated as some sort of maybe in a broad sense transcendental arguments that we have to presuppose something in order for something else to be so much as possible, and so we investigate these postulations from within our ongoing practice, so to speak, all the time, and somehow we examine what we have to postulate in order to make sense of our being committed to that practice from within that practice itself, so to speak. So I suppose these kind of standard pragmatist arguments, like the ones appealing to some sort of usefulness or satisfactoriness of our beliefs, and these kind of transcendental arguments appealing to some sort of indispensability or something's being a necessary condition for the possibility of something else in the Kantian style. I guess maybe metaphilosophically, one of my purposes, not only in this particular book, but more generally, is to somehow question the view that these are like completely distinct, or that these arguments have nothing at all to do with each other. I suppose there are all kinds of interesting connections, although someone like William James would have nothing to do with Kantian transcendental arguments. James was firmly opposed to the Kantian system, or I mean, he didn't have lots of nice things to say about Kant. He said, I think I quoted somewhere, he said the path of philosophical progress goes from the British empiricists round Kant, not through Kant.
That's interesting.
Basically to his pragmatism, I guess.
Yeah.
Anyway, around Kant, so we're not going to go through Kant. But I think he was wrong there in the sense that his own view and his own pragmatist approach is very much indebted to Kant. At least indirectly and implicitly, maybe not explicitly. Of course, he was not a Kant scholar, but he was well read in Kant. I think he did know a great deal about Kant and had read Kant's work carefully.
Yeah. So could you say that they are connected, these kind of use arguments and the more transcendental arguments, in the sense that the humanly categorized reality, or whatever our conceptual schemes, are sort of formed by what is useful to us as human beings? So like the way I view my environment now is in terms of discrete medium-sized objects, and I see you who is a person, and I kind of I kind of can anticipate that something is going to occur and assign different probabilities to things and assign modal statuses to things. And then what you're saying is that when we're doing metaphysics, we have to start with that humanly categorized reality and kind of construct our metaphysics out of what is necessary in order to make sense of that picture. But you might agree with James in that useful considerations are still baked in somewhere in that pursuit.
Yeah, useful here could be close to something that we can't really do without, like usefulness and indispensability. In some sense, of course, we would have to look at some specific cases, but yes, the kind of examples that you mentioned, and also some of these are discussed in the book. There would be, for example, this issue of modal realism. I suppose a pragmatist could argue that that we can't really do without some sort of commitment to modalities. Of course, that's extremely controversial, and there are many different philosophical ways of cashing out what that actually means in terms of possible worlds or whatever. But I suppose that the pragmatist point here would be perhaps slightly metaphilosophical in the sense that the main point would be that we have to look at the indispensability of this modal discourse and the relevant modal metaphysics in terms of our human practices and the way we structure reality from within those practices, how we conceptualize and categorize the reality we live in, instead of thinking about modal metaphysics as purely theoretical in the sense of not being related to our practical concerns at all. So yeah, I mean, again, I suppose this would be a slightly different approach from the kind of modal metaphysics that people in the mainstream analytic tradition would be engaged with, like
I mean, because I wanted to tying back to Quine. I mean, one common methodology in metaphysics today is that you look at least one practice of human beings, which is science, and you look at what is indispensable in order to make this pursuit come out possible or true. And but could you say that the difference here is that you're not only taking into account what is indispensable in science, what sort of entities or structures we have to posit in order to make scientific senses true or scientific beliefs true, but we also have to take into account more everyday activities as well and practices. Is that a good way to make the distinction?
I think that's an excellent way of putting it. In many of the pragmatists, again, especially James, in more recent pragmatism, maybe especially in Putnam, there is a strong element of pluralism. So there is a plurality of these practices, and of course, in some cases, their relations to each other might be problematic, and there might be all kinds of tensions or conflicts. But on the whole, I mean, if we're some sort of pragmatic pluralists, we would be critical of the idea that it's only science that our indispensability arguments can attach to. There are also other practices, and we need to make sense of those as well, and we need to make sense of the ways in which some metaphysical concepts or postulations are needed within those practices. For example, as you said, every day, like ordinary life, whatever that is, but then also maybe ethics, politics, even religion is an interesting case there, of course, because there the possible conflict with science is maybe more obvious than in some other areas. Definitely, I'm not saying that pragmatists should or even could be like radical relativists who would then just suggest that everything goes or anything goes, and we have all these different practices, and there are no ways of critically comparing them, and I mean there is this danger, of course, a kind of a potential slippery slope, that if we embrace something like pragmatic pluralism in James's sense, for example, then where do we draw the line? How far can we go? If not only science is okay, but also even religion could be fine, then is there any limit to how our beliefs about the world, or how our world categorization is going to be constrained? And that is a serious question. I think on the whole we have to somehow even though we want to avoid this kind of scientific focus on science merely, we still have to understand these other practices that pragmatists are hoping to make sense of. We ought to be able to understand them as somehow based on fundamental norms of rationality and the pursuit of truth, and then like critical self-reflection in inquiry, and so they could all be practices of inquiry in the pragmatists' very general sense of inquiry, like in the sense of inquiry that Dewey, for example, used in many of his works. So not only science narrowly conceived, but inquiry in a more comprehensive sense would be what he said here.
Right, but I suppose you don't have any kind of a priori or kind of principled limits to this, to how many discourses there could be, and how far you're going to extend this pragmatist metaphysics to.
No, it's a matter of inquiry itself. I mean, in that sense, I would say, I guess we should be Quinians. I mean, Quine would say it's up to science to determine what is good science. It's not up to any a priori philosophy. It's a scientific matter. How is science to be distinguished from pseudoscience? That's a scientific question. It's the scientists themselves who should tell us what good science is, not any prior philosophy. I mean, that would be a basically Quinian view, wouldn't it? And then I mean, this is perhaps too easy and simple, but if we just replace this Quinian science by something like inquiry in a more inclusive pragmatist sense, then I think it's always a matter of further inquiry, a kind of a never-ending, open-ended pragmatic inquiry, always in a way starting from where we are in the world. It's up to that kind of inquiry to determine what is going to be relevant for that inquiry. What kind of practical ways of being in the world, what kind of practices, what kind of perspectives or traditions of inquiry or contexts of inquiry would be relevant, and then it's up to that to say that, well, astrology is there is no way we could take it seriously. In ethical inquiry, it's sort of obvious that views like Nazism are not to be taken seriously. They are not part of the process of inquiry. Our rejecting them is a condition for the possibility of any inquiry or any serious discussion. But that is something that we can affirm only within the inquiry process itself. There's no sort of absolute prior philosophy to do that.
Yeah, and you kind of wonder if the Nazis are themselves going to develop a kind of another inquiry star, where they say to us that inquiry is misconceived because that doesn't include us, and then they have their inquiry star, which or we have our inquiry and we say this is from the point of view inquiry is a good thing because and inquiry cannot include all these, the totality of these pluralities of different human endeavors. But I suppose, you just have to say stop at some point and just stick with your practice, I suppose.
Yeah, this is a really, this is a tricky issue. In some ways, it's a question concerning who we are. Who is the group of or what is the group of we? We sort of find our relevant audience of discussion and serious conversation and dialogue and so. Who are we? Rorty is famous for his frequent rhetorical use of the word we. He talks about we pragmatists, we liberals, we Kuhnians, and
postmodern bourgeois liberals, I think.
Exactly, that's one of his groups of we.
Yeah.
And I suppose one of the truly important ideas in Rorty is this deep understanding of the historical contingency of this so-called we. We could be different from what we are, and there is no foundationalist a priori philosophy to tell us what exactly we should be. It's an open-ended historical process, and perhaps we should more strongly than Rorty emphasize that this is to a very important extent, this is a process of critical inquiry. We ought to continue to inquire into what kind of we ought to be, and it's a kind of a normative critical process, and Rorty's pragmatism is perhaps lacking in this sort of normative force. I mean, he's great in this emphasis on historical contingency and all that, and so my sort of, I have mixed feelings about Rorty's pragmatism. Of course, it was a tremendously important figure in late analytic philosophy and the emergence of neo-pragmatism, perhaps even more influential than Putnam. But then I have this worry that his emphasis on contingency goes so far that he leaves us with no normative resources for really critical inquiry.
Yeah.
But I'm not really discussing Rorty that much in this book that we're now focusing.
Yeah. So, okay, so let's set this issue about different kind of practices aside, and just take a look at these transcendental arguments, if you want to call them that way. So one of the arguments you have in the book is an argument against physicalism, and the argument is that if physicalism is true, then we cannot conceive of ourselves as being sort of guided by norms of inquiry, because physicalism doesn't leave any room for norms. There's a more detailed version of it in the book, but then later on you say that this argument doesn't establish that physicalism is false. It doesn't. It cannot go as far as to say that, but then my question is, what can we really establish from these arguments about our human-centered reality? Are we just establishing that we do indeed think in terms of these ways, or do we? What's the status of what we get out from pragmatist metaphysics?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Maybe that is something I actually ought to reconsider a little bit. Maybe I was slightly hesitant to simply admit that this argument is not going to show that it's false, because now that I think of that, what I had in mind was that obviously the physicalist won't be convinced by this argument. The physicalist would still say that for all we know, physicalism could still be true at the metaphysical level, so to speak, if that's simply the way the world is, independently of us. if it is indeed the case that that there is nothing but physics, or that everything is reducible to physics, or whatever. I mean, no matter how exactly you formulate physicalism, there are, of course,
Yeah.
a wide variety of different versions, and I'm not going into any detail there. Okay, so perhaps what we should say is that the transcendental argument does not demonstrate that physicalism is false in the sense in which physicalists typically, presupposing some form of metaphysical realism, as we might say, would use the concepts of truth and falsity. Maybe if we were prepared to actually employ something like the Jamesian pragmatist concept of truth, I guess then it might even be possible to claim that this transcendental argument does show, or at least provide reasons for believing that physicalism is false in the pragmatist sense of truth and falsity. It is a view that we cannot live with. There is no way we could be. I mean, I guess that is something like this is the way I try to formulate the argument there, or the conclusion would be something along these lines, that we can't possibly live live out this physicalist view. I mean, our being in the world is such that we can't be physicalists because I mean, it would be a standard transcendental argument in the sense that because already in the process of inquiring into and coming up with something like physicalism itself, we're committed to normativity and values and whatever things that are ruled out by physicalism. So we can't like consist, or there would be some sort of performative inconsistency in our being physicalists.
And this is just so just sorry to interrupt, but it's just this, in this notion of physicalism, we're here supposing that values just aren't, it's impossible to reduce values, because I suppose then if you could do that, the physicalist wouldn't have to deny that there are values. They would just have to, I mean, they just say values are sort of pain or pleasure states, or something like very complex physical state. But you're in this argument, you're sort of presupposing that this reduction is impossible. But I just wanted to.
I mean, sure. If you're a physicalist and if you're really willing to bite the bullet, you could say that this is what values are. They just are these complex states or structures that are simply parts of the physical world, in like at the fundamental metaphysical level, or something along those lines. But then I suppose my approach in critically dealing with this is Jamesian, in the sense that I'm trying to apply the pragmatic method, trying to look and see what it's like to live in terms of a view like this, or what kind of what does this view promise, to use a Jamesian expression. That's how James formulates it when he, for example, discusses materialism, not that far from physicalism. But then again, I mean, it would not only be that this James, it would also be a kind of a transcendental, so a combination of a pragmatic and a transcendental.
It's interesting.
There would be this indispensability consideration there, which we don't have in James so clearly.
I mean, maybe tying back again to Quine, I think there is like this ambiguity in the notion of like an indispensability argument, because one type of indispensability argument is just this transcendental argument, I should say, like in order to proceed with this practice we have to presuppose this, and thus like and then you have like this, the conclusion of this is just a statement of this presupposition because you are committed to that practice. So that's one kind. But then there's this other sort which says science or the ethical life or whatever is committed to the existence of this thing or this property, and because we are committed to this entity or this property in this endeavor, we have reason to believe that this entity actually exists. And this is this kind of like abductive argument that is often taken to be is put in at the end of these indispensability arguments. But I don't think you have an abductive premise in there. It's not that like we have reason to believe that physicalism is false because we can't live.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that it gives us a guide to like the noumenal world, what we are committed to or not in our ethical lives. Would you say that's a kind of a difference also with regards to the kind of neo-Quinian metaphysicians?
Maybe, yeah, I didn't really think about it exactly in those terms. It is true that in this particular book, I don't use the concept of abduction. Somewhere else, I actually did speculate with the possibility of somehow, it's kind of slightly related to this because I was trying to consider the way in which Peirce argues for what he calls real generals, for the reality of generals, like habits, laws, dispositions, and whether it's a transcendental argument or whether it's an abductive argument.
Okay.
So whether they are like indispensable in the sense of transcendental presuppositions of inquiry, or whether they're just something that we are committed to, ontologically committed to, because that is the best explanation for the fact that we are able to inquire into the ways the world is. And I suppose, I haven't really kept up with this literature in Peirce scholarship regarding these matters so carefully recently, but I suppose there are Peirce scholars who would, some of them would focus or would perhaps emphasize the abductive orientation there more than the transcendental one. But Peirce is a very complex philosopher, and certainly I don't have any well-developed theory of abduction to rely on. Many people would say that abduction in Peirce is more a matter of inventing an hypothesis or coming up with an hypothesis that would explain, rather than being an argument to the best explanation, for example, as it has sometimes been characterized. So there is quite a lot of quite interesting historical work on Peirce and abduction going on. Also, some of my colleagues in Finland are much better than me in that respect. So I would be very careful in saying anything specific about abduction. But again, that would be the kind of distinction or dichotomy between abductive and transcendental arguments would also be one of those that I suppose a pragmatist could at least try to slightly question or
that's very interesting.
Yeah,
that's so interesting. Yeah, I guess what I'm kind of trying to lurk towards, find my way towards, is this distinction you have in your book between being sort of a meta level pragmatist or a first order realist. So you said that you reject realism at a meta level, but you don't necessarily reject it at a first order level. So when you're in this practice, you can accept that there are persons and that there are objects and so on, and you can conduct metaphysics at this first level. But then when you rise to the meta level to ask whether reality sort of ultimately contains these objects, then you become a pragmatist. Is that right? Would you say?
Yeah, I suppose that is one way of describing what I'm trying to do.
Yeah.
And or at least I tried to say something along those lines myself in that book and also elsewhere. So the analogy here would be Kant, because Kant maintained that that we can we can and ought to be full-blown realists at the empirical level. So Kant, of course, was an empirical realist. Empirical objects and events like stones or trees or other human persons or whatever, or also our scientific objects like electrons or galaxies would be fully real. There would be no problem in saying that they are real independently of our theories and observations and language use and concepts and so on. Of course, we need concepts to be able to say that, but at the empirical level, we would say that these things exist, or maybe more precisely that the question whether they exist or not is not decided by our beliefs or observations or theories, but is decided by whether or not they actually exist. Okay, so that would be like the first order level, or what Kant would call the empirical level. But then famously, of course, Kant has this transcendental level of investigation where he says we ought to be transcendental idealists. The kind of the problem or the kind of background assumption that leads all philosophers prior to Kant go wrong is indeed transcendental realism, which does not really make this distinction between these different levels and or in other words, in Kant's terminology, which does not make the distinction between appearances and things as they are in themselves. Now, of course, we don't need to stick to the specific Kantian terminology, but there is something from this two-level structure that we need to maintain, I suppose. And so I'm trying to develop the kind of view that, as you said, on the meta level, so to speak, or as we might also say, the transcendental level, we have to be pragmatists. So there is so we can call this transcendental pragmatism, understanding the pursuit of metaphysics itself as something that concerns the world as it is humanly categorized. But then within that, when it comes to like first order level or empirical level issues, then we can be as full-blown realists as we wish. Now, of course, the kind of non-Kantian and non-pragmatist metaphysician would say there aren't really those two levels. There is just one world, and there is this only this one level of inquiry. We should aim at being right about the way that one world is, and there is no interesting distinction between, in Kantian terms, the transcendental and the empirical. And then it will be very difficult to answer that because then we are already dealing with philosophical assumptions that are so fundamental and saying that we are approaching these issues from a Kantian perspective is of course a shorthand for much more complex formulation that would say that we are taking seriously these and these kind of arguments and considerations and working in this this kind of or a certain tradition, that taking certain concepts and issues seriously. So this is a really complex matter. I don't know if this makes sense at all.
Yeah, no, it does make sense. Yeah. So so I guess, the thought is that we can say there are stones and we can say there are persons at this human empirical level, but we cannot go to the sort of from that to a metaphysical claim about what reality really contains. At least in this tradition, you can't.
Or metaphysical claim in the sense of metaphysical realism, or in the sense of what Kant called transcendental realism.
Yeah. So I wanted to maybe I'm not sure if it's even putting pressure on this idea, but it's just something that I thought about. So one of the transcendental arguments that you talk about in the book is an argument due to Elizabeth Cook for hope in inquiry. So this is like this argument says that if we ask a question about something, we are sort of in that practice, we are presupposing that there has to be an answer, and thus, in order to make our practice of asking questions make sense, we have to presuppose that there are answers to them. So there are answers to questions. And I guess my question was about this. I mean, we human beings, we certainly seem to have a practice of asking metaphysical questions about, the existence of universals or God or whatever it might be. And we seem to and also, we seem to be asking them in a metaphysically realist tone. We're not just wondering about what we think about reality. We're asking about like reality itself. And therefore, I was wondering, do you think one could draw a transcendental argument for transcendental realism then, or some sort of metaphysical realism, that we, in order to make sense of our practice as human inquirers, we have to presuppose metaphysical realism, because otherwise, we can't make sense of ourselves. I suppose you would reject such an argument, but
I would have to think very carefully to say. Again, not one of the easiest questions to raise, and I should think about this further, I think. But Cook's discussion, that's more or less in the Persian context, and it's within Perse scholarship. It's related to the. I mean, I think it's from her book on Perse, isn't it? And Perse's theory of inquiry, or I don't remember what the book is called, but it's about those issues anyway, and there she's examining this question about Perse interpretation, whether we should say that we have some sort of transcendental presuppositions of inquiry in Perse, or whether it's a mere hope, so to speak, that there are these real things out there that our inquiry is directed at. And I think she has some very interesting things to say there, also partly in dialogue with Chris Hookway's work on Perse and pragmatism generally. Okay, so that's one thing. I as far as I remember, that discussion is not explicitly applied to this kind of, again, meta level issue.
Yeah, exactly.
But you're.
But if you step up one level.
So it's a very interesting suggestion that we could ask those same questions about this metaphysical or metaphysically realistic inquiry itself, and then the pragmatist metaphysician who would be opposed to this metaphysically realist metaphysics, or transcendentally realist metaphysics in the Kantian sense, that kind of pragmatist would somehow have to argue that there is something wrong in those questions when they are posed at this metaphysically realistic meta level, so to speak, and that those same questions, so to speak, are fine and ought to be discussed at this first order level rather than the metaphysical realistic level. So that would have to be, I suppose, the response would be something like this whole book itself, which tries to suggest that we should somehow re-articulate those metaphysical questions as questions concerning human practices and their presuppositions and so on, and their indispensabilities and whatever, instead of these like God's eye view questions. That is one of the metaphors. When we discuss issues at this level of generality, we can't really help using some metaphors, I guess, and God's eye view is one of the metaphors that Putnam, for example, famously used frequently when characterizing what he called metaphysical realism. So the idea that we could achieve or reach something like God's eye view on the world and like see the world as a whole at that level. So I don't think I have any easy and simple answer.
Yeah.
to this, it is a serious worry and certainly an argument to be considered.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I guess you were talking about that before, with regards to this Kantian tradition and the Kantian concepts. But it seems that this distinction between the first level, the empirical level, and the transcendental level involves a certain dualism that, I mean, you might take that as part of just one of the sort of conceptual distinctions in the framework. But I mean, for example, you write at an empirical factual level, material physical entities and facts are obviously independent of our beliefs, theories, concepts, and perceptions, as any reasonable realist ought to admit. While at the transcendental level of philosophical reflections, which the pragmatist metaphysicians should invoke, such entities and facts receive their ontological structure through practice-embedded cultural interpretations and conceptualizations. And this seems to involve a sort of dualism in some sense. So there are like physical entities in one sense, but then there are these like metaphysically physical entities in another sense. And in one sense, they are dependent on us, and in another sense, they aren't. And sometimes, yeah, I think I understand what this means, but when I try to crystallize it, it often kind of falls apart in some way. So I was wondering, how should I make sense of this distinction?
I think I see what you mean, and I have the same worry. I'm not sure if this makes sense, but I hope it does. Yeah, I mean, yeah, certainly there is this worry that this is some form of there's some kind of dualism there that pragmatists usually want to avoid various dualisms. The one between theory and practice, maybe mind and body, maybe any other dualisms as well, the analytic and the synthetic.
Yeah.
Knowledge and action, maybe. Various dualisms of that kind. And also when just saying that some moments ago that there is in the end only this one ongoing process of inquiry, which is supposed to determine which are the relevant areas of inquiry, relevant problems, and so on, relevant practices that we should try to inquire into in terms of these, for example, transcendental indispensability arguments, and so on. When taking that, or when making that move, we also, in a sense, dispense with any dualism. We are somehow suggesting that it's in the end it's all pragmatic. Like pragmatism is the ultimate sort of meta level here, if you want to put it that way, or the most fundamental thing, not the foundation, because this is going to be a thoroughly anti-foundationalist position, or that's the aim at least. But the sort of overall commitment is pragmatism, and then it is only within that then we can draw contextually relevant distinctions between these different levels, for example, and those distinctions may serve some pragmatic purposes. For example, in this case, the purpose of being able to say that there is a sense in which ordinary external objects or scientific theoretical entities, for example, are realistically independent of our beliefs and so on. So we need to be able to say that. But then we also need to be able to say that in another sense, that there is also a sense in which they kind of ontologically depend on our conceptual categorization. And then it would be problematic or wrong to say the latter in a kind of anti-realist, like full-blown constructivist or constructionist anti-realist way. I mean, when people would say that electrons are constructed in the physicists' laboratories, that's not the way the reasonable pragmatist should go. There is a sense in which electrons, when it comes to their ontological identity as the kind of elementary particles they are according to physical theory, there is a sense in which they're being the kind of things they are is dependent on physical theorization. But there is also a sense in which we have to be able to say that despite this dependence, they are fully independent of whatever theories or beliefs or practices we have. Of course, we can only say this when we do have these beliefs and theories and practice. But this is precisely one reason why I think pragmatism is such a promising philosophical approach, that it at least tries to enable us to say these things, to acknowledge this sense in which there are these, or acknowledge this way in which things can be independent of us and dependent on us at the same time.
Yeah.
To put it very simply and crudely.
I don't know if this is the right way to put it, but could you say that electrons are independent of us, but their independence of us is dependent on us?
That's an excellent formula. I would fully subscribe to that one.
Yeah. Although, I'm kind of I've been thinking about that, but I don't know enough about the logic of dependence to know if that's even possible. But I will certainly.
Maybe there is also the danger that the concept of independence or independence would be used differently in this.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So I mean, I suppose with regards to this this meta level dependency, I mean, on the first level, I suppose the motivation for being a reasonable pragmatist and say that sort of electrons are independent of us is that you would get otherwise really strange counterfactuals, like impossible worlds where there are no human inquirers or no theories. There wouldn't be any electrons, which just sounds absurd. What's the reason to not suspect that this would also occur at the meta level? So that, I mean, if I say, isn't it also absurd in some sense to say that if there are no human inquirers or no theories, then there are no electrons at this meta level, or there are no I mean, what? Yeah, I don't even know what the counterfactual will be at the meta level, but
there would be no fact of the matter whether electrons are independent or dependent.
Something like that. I suppose if it is dependent on us that they are independent of us, then if we didn't exist, there wouldn't be a fact of the matter whether they are independent of us, and that also seems kind of absurd from my point of view as an inquirer. So how do I how should I think about this as a reasonable pragmatist?
Well, these are really, really difficult issues.
Yeah.
I don't feel to be able to adequately resolve them in this conversation, but maybe, I mean, of course, in some sense, we can climb onto additional meta levels.
That's cool.
Up the hierarchy of different meta levels here. Then, if our overall commitment is pragmatism, it is kind of this pragmatist process of inquiry within which we are, so to speak, using these or employing these meta level, first order level distinctions for our purposes of making sense of these. Making sense of the world, making sense of our practices of dealing with the world. Then it might be asked what kind of purposes these meta levels or these distinctions between meta level issues and first order level issues serve, and so maybe it could be suggested that the relevant context for these counterfactuals is really the first order level, where there should be no problem. We should definitely not claim that there would be no electrons in a world without human beings, and so on. So it's precisely in order to avoid any naive anti-realism or any straightforward constructivism, which I guess some more radical pragmatists might end up with, that we draw these distinctions between these different levels. But even those distinctions take place within this overall pragmatist process of inquiry. Maybe I should add one thing regarding, you asked in the beginning about my interpretation of pragmatism in general. Maybe I should add that one of the ways of developing pragmatism that I find highly useful and also maybe relevant to this discussion, not so much discussed in this particular book, is what Morton White calls holistic pragmatism. Holistic in the sense that it's ultimately one and the same inquiry, including, as he emphasizes, both factual questions and normative questions, for example, epistemology and ethics, for example, and many other things as well. So the idea that pragmatist inquiry is a kind of a holistic process of continuously adjusting our views and beliefs to the world we live in. That's a kind of an extension from Quinean holism, which is basically just a scientific holism in the sense that we have the totality of scientific theory, but in this more radical holistic pragmatism, we have the full set of our beliefs or commitments, and we try to somehow adjust them continuously, more or less as the Quinean view says that we are adjusting our scientific theories. And then the same kind of meta-level questions can be asked. Morton White himself considers the question whether holistic pragmatism itself as a kind of meta-level principle guiding our inquiries is to be critically tested.
Holistically,
yeah. So these kind of questions can be endlessly asked, and certainly there is a sense in which holistic pragmatism itself can be revised and modified and adjusted and so on, possibly even given up in some extreme situations. But again, that would have to that critical testing itself would have to take place within holistic pragmatism. Or again, analogously, consider Quine again. Quine considers occasionally some of these views that we would find non-scientific or maybe even pseudoscientific. Let's say telepathy. I think he has this telepathy example somewhere, and he maybe it's in The Pursuit of Truth. I'm not quite sure. Anyway, he says that if science really conclusively shows us that there is this thing that people call telepathy, then we would just have to follow science. It would tremendously change our picture or our scientific picture of the world. But then we would just have to do that if science really showed us this.
Yeah, sure. Yes, but I think that's easier to understand, I think, than these philosophical examples. I guess he's most famous for thinking that logic can be revised. I guess that's the most radical version of the view. But philosophically, that science could have us revise whether, for example, conformational holism is the right theory or not. I wonder what it would even take to for it to be the case that we kind of give up holism, but still, as you say, if we are holists at a meta level, we could give up holism on the first order level. And then the question is, in what sense are we still holists?
But there are, I think, interesting Quinian analogies to this, because when it comes to this revisability of logic, for example, you could say that some fundamental logical principles are the condition for our being able to understand what a theory says, for example. They're not just like revisable exactly in the same sense in which some ordinary theoretical statement is revisable. But then the Quinian holist is radical enough to say that in principle, even those logical statements could be revised. Or even, I mean, Quine, of course, was an extensionalist. And I think he admitted somewhere that if science forced us to give up extensionalism, then we would even have to do that, even though that's kind of a criterion for or being able to understand what a theory says. So I mean, these are really complex issues, and we easily end up with kind of paradoxical situations here. What if the pragmatist process of inquiry convinced us that pragmatism is wrong, that we ought not to be pragmatists?
I mean, it's that thing which I'm kind of wondering about. In what sense are we still, at what level are we pragmatists then? I mean, it seems that there's almost something ineffable about it, or something kind of you can't really express it. In that when I'm doing theorizing, in order to do theorizing correctly, I have to presuppose that the objects of my theorizing are not completely dependent on my theory. So in order to be a good pragmatist, I must, in some sense, reject the dependency of objects upon my conceptual scheme. But on the other hand, in some kind of meta level, on a theoretical level, pragmatism, or at least pragmatist metaphysics, in your view, must claim that there is some sort of dependency, at least. And I guess that's a sort of a tension that it might lead you to think that if you're in your everyday life as a pragmatist, you can't be a pragmatist. But then when you're theorizing, you can, when you go home to your office and write philosophy books, you can be one. But then I don't know if
but then, I mean, if you sure, in some sense, but then if the very point of pragmatism is to criticize this dichotomy between life and philosophical theory, then that is a tension, that is a real problem. But then we could also, I mean, one way of somehow answering this would be to insist on this purpose relativity or purpose dependence of these distinctions between these different levels of inquiry. Because then it is precisely for the purposes of this philosophical attempt to understand in a pragmatist way this the nature of inquiry or the practices of inquiry that we draw these distinctions between the so-called first order level and middle level. So the distinctions would not be there; they would not be given to us independently of our philosophical concerns to understand what's going on here. So you wouldn't have to operate in terms of these distinctions at all if you don't have the kind of philosophical questions to ask about realism, about metaphysics, and so if you just focus on your everyday life, or on your scientific life, you can just operate within or at the first order level, so to speak.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I agree with you that maybe this won't be settled within the course of this conversation. Although that would be a very nice thing for my podcast if it were the case. But yeah, I wanted to ask you before we wrap up soon. So you work in the philosophy of religion, and I've been kind of curious about the relationship between this metaphysical realism and the theistic picture of the world, because at least it seems that a lot of the formulations of realism have some sort of theological spin to them. So, for example, it's often stated like metaphysical questions are questions about what God would have needed in order to create the world. Like, fundamentally, what did he just need? Atoms and particles? Did he also need values when he did this, or that sort of stuff? Or it's stated that metaphysical questions are about how the book of the world is written. Which is also, I mean, I guess you can. For me, it's kind of hard to see how this would even make sense without someone having written the book. I mean, it just metaphorically, that the way that metaphor works. I mean, maybe there are other ways to cash that out, but just there seems to be some sort of theological spin to metaphysics. And how do you, having worked in the philosophy of religion, think of this like metaphysical realism versus pragmatism? Do you think there are any relations at all to?
Yeah, that is interesting. I haven't really thought about that, except as you said, as a kind of a metaphorical way of speaking.
Yeah.
I suppose if we look at, again, something like mainstream analytic philosophy today, whatever that is, I mean, most of the people who would be some sort of metaphysical realists would presumably be atheists, or some sort of physicalists, materialists, naturalists, and so the prominent forms of metaphysical realism today would hardly be theistic. Then there is this relatively small field called philosophy of religion within philosophy, and many of the scholars working on philosophy of religion defend some form of theism, I suppose, and many of them, or most of them, would be metaphysical realists when it comes to discussing theism and atheism. Now, I don't have any projects of that kind. I mean, I'm not defending either theism or atheism. So, although I do think that pragmatist metaphysics is possible and maybe desirable, and philosophers can discuss even questions such as the reality of God in this metaphysical sense when conceived pragmatically. I haven't really felt any need to take any firm stand on this question at this metaphysical level, so to speak. Rather, I want to develop philosophy of religion as a kind of a critical humanistic pursuit of understanding what it means for some people to be committed to religious forms of life, as Wittgensteinians might put it, or to be engaged in religious practices. What kind of commitments are made there? Are they really metaphysical commitments in some sense, or is it? Well, I guess the Wittgensteinian approach would say that they are mostly like ways of using language in certain ways, in certain situations and certain contexts of life. There would be all kinds of interesting parallels between Wittgensteinian philosophy of religion and pragmatism, but I'm not sure if we can go into that direction here. But I guess many of these issues that we have been discussing in a very general way concerning pragmatist metaphysics and pragmatism in general, they can also be applied to philosophy of religion more specifically. But there the mainstream would be metaphysically realistic theism. Then, of course, there is a certain certain segment in the field, so to speak, that is atheistic philosophy of religion, and often these debates between theism and atheism are rather polarized, and there is this science religion conflict in some ways, and I think pragmatism here, as in many other contexts, can also be a kind of a bridge builder in some ways, and take a step to the meta level to try to look and see what's actually going on there, and what kind of pragmatically analyzable presuppositions are being made, and what is indispensable for what, and so on. And also, I think one more thing would be the ethical dimensions of these metaphysical debates, because I would follow Kant in insisting that philosophy of religion has to be grounded in ethics primarily, and that would also, in my view, be a kind of a pragmatist way to go. Also, something we at least implicitly find in James. But that may be a longer story.
I think that's really that's interesting about that connection, and I think that ties into my last question about the place of pragmatism in practice, although we discussed that a little bit, and this is what I mean, do you think pragmatist metaphysics itself has some kind of practical ethical importance, and not just in saying what the ethical importance of various first order views are, but of this view itself? Like, do you think it if I become a pragmatist metaphysician, will I become more kind of at ease with the metaphysical disputes, or maybe more pluralistically tolerant? Or do you think there are any kind of good practical benefits of this, or any practical problems as well, I suppose? But
maybe the kind of tolerance or openness to a plurality of different perspectives on the world, the kind of human diversity that we have, maybe that could be one, if you want to call it a benefit. One reason why pragmatism more generally is a promising philosophical approach, I think, and also the kind of acknowledgement of human finitude and fallibility and contingency and all that, that we really do not possess the kind of God's eye view where we could tell everybody else what the world is like at the ultimate level, and that we do have to go through this painful process of never-ending inquiry in order to say anything at all, and we have to constantly self-critically reconsider our own approach or approaches in this inquiry, and so maybe again at some kind of meta level, this would be a pragmatic value of being a pragmatist, but then being a pragmatist here probably also brings with it all kinds of difficulties and problems, such as these worries about, relativism, worries of the kind that we just discussed about how coherent it is to operate in terms of these different levels of inquiry, if on the other hand this is supposed to be a kind of a holistic project of inquiry. So it's not self-evident that this pragmatist approach is coherent. That is something that also needs to be, again, self-critically inquired into. But maybe also at the meta level we could say that it is a kind of a pragmatically valuable thing to acknowledge that there is this ethical dimension to metaphysical problems and metaphysical theories and ideas, that it matters what we think and say about the ways the world is, even at the kind of abstract general level that metaphysics typically deals with. That it's not a trivial, like a merely academic dispute when it comes to even rather technical theoretical matters such as modalities, for example, or universals. Even those questions do have an ethical dimension, and all of those questions are questions that human beings ask, and maybe realizing that and trying to make sense of that is somehow ethically relevant, at least.
Yeah.
Or so I would hope.
Yeah, we can just have this this hope, at least. Yes, but then, yeah, with those words, I want to thank you so much for wanting to participate in this, and it's been such an amazing, such a very interesting dialogue. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.